Ejaz Lakdawala, a street-smart hustler from Byculla, and his ruthless rise through Mumbai's underworld would change the city forever, leaving a trail of fear, betrayal and blood that no one could forget. In the heart of Mumbai's crowded Byculla neighborhood, narrow lanes wound between crumbling buildings and noisy markets. It was here that Ejaz Lakdawala's story began. In a place where life was tough and dreams were rare, his family lived a modest life, struggling to make ends meet while the world around them seemed full of opportunity and danger. From a young age, Ejaz saw two versions of Mumbai, the one that worked hard and stayed poor, and the other that broke the rules and got rich. He made his choice early. As a teenager, Ejaz ran errands for small-time bookies and bootleggers who operated from behind tea stalls and mechanic shops. He learned how money moved through the streets, how debts were collected, and how fear could be more powerful than friendship. Every day was a lesson, and he was a fast learner. His sharp mind and calm nature made him stand out. When other boys fought blindly, Ejaz observed quietly, waiting for the right time to strike. He had the patience of a hunter and the ambition of a king. By his early 20s, Ejaz was already running a small group of men who handled gambling, protection money, and petty extortion. They operated in the shadows, always careful not to attract too much attention. Yet, no one could ignore the growing power of the young man who never raised his voice, but always got what he wanted. The local shopkeepers feared him, the police watched him, and rival gangs tried to bring him down, but Ejaz always stayed one step ahead. He was clever enough to use the system against itself, bribing officials when needed, and disappearing when things got risky. But it wasn't just money or power that drove him. Ejaz wanted control, complete control over his surroundings. He saw how the city's real power belonged to those who operated outside the law. The smugglers, the arms dealers, and the crime lords who lived in luxury while ordinary people suffered. To him they weren't villains. They were survivors who understood how the world really worked, and he wanted to be one of them. His big break came when he crossed paths with an old gangster who had once worked for the infamous Karim Lala syndicate. The man saw in Ejaz the same fire he once had in his youth. He began to mentor him, teaching him the unspoken rules of the underworld: when to strike, when to retreat, and how to build loyalty through both fear and respect. Ejaz followed every word carefully. He knew that one wrong move could end his journey before it even began. Soon, he began expanding his operations beyond Byculla. His men started collecting protection money from bars, garages, and transport companies. He moved quietly, avoiding unnecessary violence, preferring to use intimidation and influence instead. His name spread across South Mumbai, whispered in markets and police stations alike. The boy who once delivered tea to bookies had now become a man of power. Yet beneath his calm surface, Ejaz carried a dangerous secret. He believed he was destined for greatness, greater than any don who came before him. His rise was no accident. It was the result of patience, intelligence, and an unshakable will. But the higher he climbed, the more dangerous the fall would become. And though he didn't know it yet, his journey had just begun, leading him into the darkest corners of Mumbai's underworld, where power always came with a price. By the early 1990s, Mumbai's underworld was ruled by a single name: Dawood Ibrahim. His influence reached from the slums of Dongri to the skyscrapers of Nariman Point, controlling everything from gold smuggling to film financing. For a young and ambitious Ejaz Lakdawala, this was the world he dreamed of. Enter. His growing reputation in Byculla had already caught the attention of Dawood's men. They saw him not just another street criminal, but someone with brains, patience, and courage. When word finally came that Dawood's lieutenants wanted to meet him, Ejaz knew it was his opportunity to step out of the shadows. The meeting changed his life. He was recruited into the D Company's vast network and assigned to oversee extortion and protection rackets across Mumbai's western suburbs. It was a dangerous position, but also one filled with power and promise. Overnight, Ejaz went from being a local enforcer to a key player in one of the world's most feared criminal empires. He began handling deals worth millions, collecting payments from builders, businessmen, and film producers who wanted to keep their projects safe. The underworld had its own rules, and now Ejaz was enforcing them. Under Dawood's shadow, he learned new ways of operating. Violence was no longer the first option. It was the last resort. The real power came from influence, information, and fear. Every move was planned with precision. Ejaz adapted quickly to this new world, where alliances were fragile and betrayal was never far away. His calm manner and sharp mind made him stand out even among Dawood's senior men. Soon, he began to attract his own following, young criminals who admired his confidence and discipline. But success came with its own dangers. The more powerful Ejaz became, the more others in the organization began to see him as a threat. Some envied his growing network, while others questioned his loyalty. Rumors began to spread that he wanted to operate independently, that he was secretly building his own empire under Dawood's nose. At first, Ejaz ignored the whispers, but the tension around him continued to grow. He knew that in the underworld, suspicion could kill faster than a bullet. The real breaking point came when one of his men was caught double-dealing with a rival gang. Dawood's senior aides accused Ejaz of losing control and demanded punishment. Ejaz saw it differently. He believed he was being set up. The situation escalated into open hostility, with both sides quietly plotting against each other. For years he had served the D Company faithfully, but now he realized that loyalty in this world was only useful as long as it benefited those in power. The cracks in his relationship with Dawood's men widened with every passing month. Business disputes turned into street wars, and allies became enemies overnight. Ejaz began to see himself not as a follower, but as a leader trapped in someone else's empire. He knew that the only way to survive was to break free. In the world of crime, leaving a powerful organization like D Company was almost impossible. But Ejaz was not an ordinary man. He had always found a way to escape the impossible. As Mumbai's skyline glittered with new towers and fortunes, a silent war was brewing in its shadows. Dawood's empire was strong, but a dangerous rival was rising from within. Ejaz Lakdawala was done taking orders. He wanted control, respect, and freedom. What he didn't realize was that his decision to walk away would spark one of the most violent power struggles the Mumbai underworld had ever seen, a war that would define his life and make his name feared across continents. The fragile peace between Ejaz Lakdawala and Dawood Ibrahim's men shattered like glass. One humid night in Mumbai. It began with whispers, rumors that Ejaz was planning to form his own network, that he had already begun recruiting D Company's loyal men with promises of greater freedom and money. For Dawood's lieutenants, this was treachery. What had once been quiet mistrust now turned into open hostility. The underworld, always ruled by fear and greed, was about to witness a bloody war. The first attack came without warning. One of Ejaz's closest associates was ambushed outside a hotel in Bandra, his car riddled with bullets. The message was clear: the woodsmen wanted to remind Ejaz who controlled Mumbai. But instead of retreating, Ejaz struck back with precision. Within days, 2 key D Company enforcers were found dead, executed in the same brutal manner. Mumbai's streets, already familiar with gang violence, turned into a battleground. Ordinary citizens lived in fear as gunfire echoed through busy markets and quiet alleyways alike. The media began reporting on the sudden surge of gang-related murders, but few knew the real reason behind it. Behind the headlines, Ejaz was waging a silent but strategic war. He used every contact he had built over the years. Corrupt officers, small-time smugglers, and rival gangs who wanted a piece of Dawood's crumbling empire. For Ejaz, this wasn't just revenge, it was a declaration of independence. He wanted to build something of his own, something that would outlive the shadow of his former boss. The police tried to intervene, launching raids across the city, but the chaos was too deeply rooted. Each night brought new killings, and each morning revealed another victim linked to the conflict. Businessmen began receiving calls from unknown numbers, demanding money for protection. Those who refused faced mysterious fires, kidnappings, or worse. The line between crime and survival blurred, and Mumbai's underworld slipped deeper into anarchy. As pressure mounted, Ejaz knew he could no longer operate openly. Too many eyes were watching him. One of his safe houses was raided, and several of his men were arrested. Sensing the walls closing in, he made a bold decision to vanish. With fake documents and the help of a few loyal allies, he slipped out of India under a new identity. Some said he escaped to Nepal, others claimed Dubai or Malaysia. The truth was known to no one. All that remained were rumors and a growing legend of the man who dared to defy Dawood. While the police celebrated the supposed end of the gang war, Ejaz was far from finished. In exile, he began planning his next move. He made secret contacts abroad, learned the methods of international crime syndicates, and quietly rebuilt his network from afar. For him, survival was not enough. He wanted dominance. The blood he had spilled in Mumbai was only the beginning of a larger game. Back in the city, Dawood's men claimed victory, but they knew it was temporary. There were whispers in the underworld that Ejaz was alive, stronger, and more dangerous than ever. His disappearance only added to his myth, turning him into a ghost story told among gangsters, a man who escaped death and law alike. What none of them knew was that Ejaz Lakdawala was already planning his return, and when he came back, it wouldn't be to take orders, it would be to rule. Far from the chaos of Mumbai's streets, Ejaz Lakdawala began a new life under a different name. After escaping India, he traveled through several countries before finally settling in Canada. There, in the quiet suburbs, he blended into ordinary life, posing as a businessman with legal ventures. But behind this mask, he was building something far more dangerous. The boy from Byculla had transformed into a global operator, running his network across continents. What began as survival had now turned into expansion. Ejaz wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was becoming an international crime strategist. Canada gave him the distance and safety he needed. Using forged passports and encrypted communication lines, he reconnected with old contacts spread across the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Smuggling, drug trafficking, and money laundering became the new face of his empire. He forged partnerships with local cartels, offering his experience in managing routes and hiding transactions. Each move was calculated, each deal carefully planned to avoid exposure. He operated through shell companies, fake identities, and offshore accounts, creating an invisible chain of power that stretched from Mumbai to Dubai, from Karachi to Toronto. Ejaz's operations in India continued through his trusted men. They collected extortion money, managed real estate investments, and kept the fear of his name alive in Mumbai's underworld. He rarely spoke directly with them, using coded messages and intermediaries to give orders. To his enemies he was a ghost, unseen but always present. Police files mentioned him often, but his exact location remained a mystery. International agencies began to take notice of his activities, linking his name to several money laundering cases that crossed borders. Still, there was never enough evidence to bring him down. While living abroad, Ejaz learned to play the game of power at a higher level. He started dealing with businessmen, corrupt officials, and brokers who laundered millions through legitimate industries. His influence reached into film production, real estate, and even sports betting. He was no longer the man carrying a gun in the streets. Now he controlled the men who did. His understanding of money and manipulation made him as powerful as any don sitting in Dubai or Karachi. Yet despite his success, he could never escape his past completely. Back in Mumbai, rival gangs tried to erase his legacy, claiming his territories and spreading rumors of his death. But every few months, a sudden attack or mysterious disappearance would remind them that Ejaz was still alive. He kept his enemies guessing, feeding false information through informants, making everyone wonder when and where he might strike next. Fear became his greatest weapon. But with power came paranoia. The more his empire grew, the harder it became to control. Some of his overseas associates began taking more money than agreed, while others secretly made deals with his rivals. His name, once whispered in fear, was now being mentioned in international investigations. Interpol had opened a file on him, and the Indian police were quietly coordinating with foreign agencies. Ejaz didn't panic, he adapted. He shifted his base frequently, changing homes and identities like a man changing clothes. But deep down, he knew the walls were closing in. The underworld thrived on loyalty, yet loyalty was the one thing he could no longer trust. The global empire he had built was strong but fragile, and somewhere within it, betrayal was waiting to strike. The hunter of Mumbai was now being hunted on a much larger stage, and this time, his survival would depend on more than just fear. It would depend on how well he could outsmart the entire world. Success had made Ejaz Lakdawala powerful, but power had also made him careless. Years of operating from foreign soil had created distance between him and the people who once swore loyalty to him. His men in Mumbai grew ambitious. His overseas partners grew greedy. And slowly, cracks began to appear in his empire. At first the signs were small, a shipment delayed without reason, a payment missing from one of his accounts, a trusted courier disappearing without explanation. Ejaz dismissed them as minor issues, unaware that the rot had already started from within. Among his trusted circle was a man named Rahim, one of his oldest lieutenants who had managed Ejaz's affairs in India. Rahim had once been fiercely loyal, but after years of watching his boss enjoy luxury abroad while he took the risks on the ground, his loyalty turned to resentment. He began leaking information to rival gangs, hoping to weaken Ejaz's control and carve a place for himself. What started as quiet betrayal soon escalated into dangerous exposure. Through Rahim, sensitive details about Ejaz's operations began reaching both criminals and law enforcement. The first major blow came when one of Ejaz's money laundering routes through the Middle East was dismantled by authorities. Several accounts were frozen, and millions were lost overnight. The incident alarmed him, but the full scale of betrayal was still unknown. Within weeks, more of his safe networks began collapsing. Longtime associates refused to take his calls. Payments stopped arriving. Even his most trusted men started vanishing, fearing police raids and gang retaliation. The invisible empire he had built with such care was crumbling like sand slipping through his fingers. As investigators in multiple countries began connecting the dots, Ejaz's name reappeared in intelligence circles. His communication networks were traced, and several of his former allies were arrested. The international silence that had protected him for years was finally breaking. Behind the scenes, Rahim continued feeding information to the authorities, providing them with coded transaction details and travel routes. In return, he received protection and the promise of a new life abroad. Ejaz had always known that betrayal was inevitable in the underworld, but he never expected it to come from the man he had trusted most. When he finally discovered the truth, it was too late. His finances were compromised, his partners were being interrogated, and his reputation had taken a fatal hit. Rival gangs who once feared him now saw weakness. They began seizing his remaining territories in Mumbai, using his downfall to rebuild their own dominance. The fear that once protected Ejaz was disappearing fast. For the first time in his life, he was running out of both money and trust. Haunted by the collapse of his empire, Ejaz withdrew into isolation. The man who once commanded hundreds of men now lived in silence, moving between safe houses under different names. He trusted no one, spoke to no one, and lived with the constant thought that every phone call could be his last. Betrayal had cut deeper than any bullet. But even in defeat, Ejaz refused to surrender. He began gathering the little information he could, trying to rebuild connections and track those who had turned against him. Deep inside, anger replaced fear. The fall of his empire had not destroyed him. It had changed him. If he ever returned to India, he would not come back as the same man who left. This time, there would be no alliances, no loyalty, and no mercy. The betrayal that had nearly ended his life would become the reason for his most dangerous chapter yet. After years of exile, Ejaz Lakdawala made a calculated decision to return to India. The city he had once ruled from the shadows had changed, but the pulse of Mumbai's underworld remained the same, violent, unpredictable, and ruthless. He knew that returning openly would mean certain death, so he adopted a new identity, blending into the city as just another businessman. Under this disguise he quietly observed the streets he once controlled, noting which gangs had risen, which territories had shifted, and which old allies had survived the chaos. The man who had once inspired fear now relied on patience and caution to survive. Ejaz's return was not about reclaiming territory immediately, it was about gathering power discreetly. He began contacting old acquaintances, the ones he could trust, to quietly rebuild his network. Extortion rackets were restarted under new management, and small-time operators were brought under his wing, unaware of the true identity of the man guiding them. He avoided violence unless absolutely necessary, preferring to manipulate the system from behind the scenes. Yet, even in secrecy, his name carried weight. Those who had known him in the past whispered warnings to rivals, keeping the legend alive. The Mumbai police, however, had not forgotten him. Though Ejaz operated under a new identity, his methods left traces. Anonymous tips began pointing authorities toward suspicious financial transactions and unusual activity patterns. Every safe house he used, every phone he touched, had to be carefully managed to avoid detection. Despite his skill in evasion, the shadow of law enforcement loomed closer than ever. He realized that returning to India was a dangerous gamble, but one he needed to take if he wanted to reclaim influence. Rival gangs, sensing an opportunity, began moving aggressively in the absence of a known power. Some sought to capture his old territories, while others attempted to eliminate loyalists who still reported back to him. Ejaz observed silently, taking note of weaknesses and alliances that could be exploited. In his mind, the streets of Mumbai were a chessboard, and he intended to play each move carefully. He had survived assassination attempts, betrayal, and international manhunts. He would not be undone by mere opportunists. Despite his careful planning, mistakes began to creep in. One of his intermediaries was careless, leaving a trail that investigators could follow. The encrypted communications he relied on were intercepted, giving authorities small pieces of the puzzle needed to locate him. While these errors did not immediately endanger his life, they reminded Ejaz that the game had changed. Mumbai's underworld was no longer just about fear, it was also about intelligence, surveillance, and timing. Even as tension mounted, Ejaz continued rebuilding. He leveraged his knowledge of the underworld to strike deals quietly, acquiring influence over businesses, construction projects, and transportation networks. These ventures provided both income and strategic cover, allowing him to operate under the radar. The man who had once been a visible threat now became a ghost, moving carefully, making alliances and enemies in equal measure. Every night, as the city slept, Ejaz planned his next steps. He knew that the longer he remained undetected, the stronger he could become. But he also understood that his return had triggered a ripple effect. Police, rival gangs, and former associates were all watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. Survival required more than cunning, it required patience, foresight, and a readiness to strike when the time was right. Ejaz Lakdawala was back in Mumbai, silent, calculating, and more dangerous than ever. And though few realized it, the city's underworld was on the brink of a confrontation that would shake it to its core. After years of careful planning, Ejaz Lakdawala's past finally caught up with him. The Indian authorities, working in coordination with international agencies, had begun piecing together his movements. Years of careful evasion had created a trail, encrypted phone calls, financial transfers, and patterns in his overseas business dealings, that led investigators closer and closer to him. Despite his intelligence and meticulous planning, even the most cautious moves could not prevent a network of modern surveillance from closing in. What had once been a game of intuition and fear now required more than street smarts. It demanded evasion in a world ruled by technology. Ejaz's downfall began with a seemingly minor interception. A single phone call, intended to coordinate a business transaction in Mumbai, was intercepted by law enforcement. The encrypted code he relied on was broken, revealing his location in Patna. The discovery sent shockwaves through the underworld. Men who once feared him began preparing for his capture, some hoping to take advantage of his vulnerability. Others determined to prove their loyalty to the authorities by providing information. For the first time in decades, Ejaz felt the walls closing in, a reality that even his careful planning could not entirely prevent. The operation to capture him was swift and meticulous. Multiple police units coordinated, surrounding the safe house where he had been hiding. Ejaz's usual escape routes were blocked, and the sheer scale of the operation left him with no room to maneuver. Even so, he attempted to resist, using his knowledge of security and evasion to delay his capture. But after hours of tense standoff and careful strategy by law enforcement, the notorious gangster was finally apprehended. His arrest sent ripples through Mumbai's criminal circles. Men who had once worked for him, and men who had opposed him, alike felt the shock of a chapter closing in the city's underworld. The aftermath of his arrest revealed the complexity of his crimes. Police discovered elaborate networks of money laundering, extortion, smuggling, some of which spanned multiple continents. Evidence of partnerships with international crime syndicates, shell companies, and illegal transactions confirmed the magnitude of his operations. Authorities were astonished by the scale and organization of his empire, constructed in careful secrecy over decades. Items recovered from his hideouts included false identities, encrypted devices, and detailed records of his operations, demonstrating the level of planning that had allowed him to evade capture for so long. Even as he sat in custody, Ejaz's reputation remained formidable. The fear he inspired in Mumbai's streets had not faded. His men and rivals still whispered his name. The underworld was forced to reorganize, with alliances shifting and power structures realigning in response to his absence. For law enforcement, his capture was both a victory and a challenge. While one man was behind bars, the networks he had built continued to operate in fragmented but dangerous forms. Ejaz himself remained calm, a man accustomed to danger and betrayal. The arrest did not break him. It forced him to confront the reality that the world had changed. The tactics of the street had been overtaken by intelligence, surveillance, and international cooperation. Yet even in confinement, his mind remained active, calculating, and observant. He understood that while his freedom was gone, his influence was far from over, and the story of his life would continue to shape Mumbai's underworld for years to come. The arrest of Ejaz Lakdawala marked the end of one era, and the beginning of another. His empire had fallen, but his legacy, the violence, the fear, and the cunning, remained etched in the city's memory. For the authorities, it was a rare victory. For the criminals, a lesson in the price of ambition. For Mumbai, it was a stark reminder that in the shadows of the city, power is fleeting, and no king, however feared, can rule forever without consequence. Even after Ejaz Lakdawala's arrest, his name continued to echo through the streets of Mumbai. Underworld, which had once trembled at his mere mention, began to shift and realign, but the void he left behind was more than just a gap in leadership. It was an opportunity and a warning. Rival gangs moved quickly to claim his former territories, attempting to absorb his former lieutenants and exploit the fear that still lingered among businessmen and local communities. Yet for those who had survived his reign, the memory of his intelligence, ruthlessness, and foresight was never far away. While his empire had fractured, fragments of it continued to operate under new leadership. Some of his lieutenants had turned informants, helping law enforcement piece together the intricacies of his global network. Others, however, had seized power for themselves, establishing small empires in different parts of the city and across India. Mumbai's criminal landscape became a puzzle of shifting alliances, betrayals, and sudden acts of violence, each echoing the methods that Ejaz had perfected years ago. His influence lingered not just in fear but in strategy. The careful, calculated way he ran his operations became a blueprint for emerging gang leaders. For the police, the capture of Ejaz was a hard-fought victory, but the work did not end with his arrest. The investigation revealed a web of crime that spanned continents, from money laundering and drug trafficking to extortion and smuggling. His name appeared in records from Dubai, Canada, and Southeast Asia, forcing authorities to coordinate internationally. The complexity of his empire was staggering. It had taken decades to construct, and while it had been dismantled, the lessons he left behind continued to inform both criminal and law enforcement strategies. Despite the chaos and the shifting power structures, Ejaz remained a figure of fascination. To ordinary citizens, he was a symbol of the dark side of ambition. A man who rose from poverty to control a vast criminal network, and then vanished into myth and legend. To the criminal community, he was a standard by which cunning and audacity were measured. Stories of his escapes, his strategic brilliance, and his capacity for both loyalty and ruthless vengeance were passed from one generation of gangsters to the next. His life became a cautionary tale, a reminder that power comes with both rewards and consequences. Even behind bars, Ejaz's presence was felt. His followers and rivals alike monitored his movements, calculated their own actions around his reputation, and adjusted strategies to avoid provoking him. The fear that once protected him outside now persisted in whispers and rumors inside. Jail walls could contain his body, but they could not contain the influence of his name. His story was studied, analyzed, and retold. A living example of how the underworld operated, and how ambition could both elevate and destroy. The legacy of Ejaz Lakdawala is a complex one. He was a man who understood the intricacies of power, the value of fear, and the cost of betrayal. His empire may have fallen, but the echoes of his methods and the lessons of his rise and fall continued to shape Mumbai's underworld. In the end, his story serves as a reminder that no matter how high one climbs, every throne in the shadows is temporary. The streets of Mumbai may always produce kings, but Ejaz's reign proved that even the most cunning and ruthless will eventually face the consequences of ambition. His life, his crimes, and his legacy endure as a dark, cautionary tale, a testament to the fact that in the underworld, power is fleeting, but its memory can last forever.